Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Planet Zoo. We're back here in Arcadia and you're going to notice a few things that have changed. A lot of the forested areas that were in the background have been removed and replaced by sandbanks, and that's just to give me a guide because after rewatching bits of footage from last week's episode I wasn't completely happy, so I ended up shutting the zoo down, kicking everybody out, which has caused us a little bit of financial issues, but we're going to do a finishing touches episode today. I want to kind of improve a lot of the things that have happened quite quickly here and get them ready for the tour that we are going to do to kind of signify the end of this first section. Like I said, I wasn't completely happy with how things went last week. I feel like it was a bit rushed and there were a few things that I was really self-critical of, which I think is important. You've got to evaluate these things. Anyway, we're going to jump into a speed build and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the finishing touches that we're doing today. So let's get into it. First things first, we're going to be finishing off our car park. Now, this just needs a few road signages put in and just the expansion of those car parking spaces, basically. This was a little bit of a tweaky little situation. I didn't quite get the things measured up properly, but I'm happy with how it all looks, and it's then allowed us to put in a few planters and a couple of like car park signifiers, like some barriers and things like that, just to kind of make sure that people are paying and displaying. That's what we call it here in the UK anyway. I could have done a little bit more here, but because it's not actually going to serve as a huge part of the zoo, I didn't feel like it was necessary to do too much detailing on it. It's simple, it's a car park, that's all you need to know. And although it doesn't have a great capacity, we could put another one in, but I then had an idea to have 4 different guest spawn areas all the way around the zoo when we eventually get that far into it, which would mean we'd have one on the top side, the back side, and the left and right hand side of things. And that's just a kind of way for us to get more guests into the zoo, and then we can maybe put a few more train stations in that would take everybody to the centre of Old Town. Now, I haven't forgotten about my other expansion ideas where we have an underground metro system, and that might be something that I'm going to need to think about moving forward when we build our new areas, because, well, that's a big project and we're going to need to make sure that there's space in the zoo already, otherwise we're going to have to do some redevelopment moving forward as well. But that's all part of the process, and as you can see here, I'm still having issues with the process, not being able to select things that I need. Anyway, the car park was just about finished, and then we put in a few planters, then filled them with mulch. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of stuff here. There's a lot of foliage in here, because I feel like we've not done a great deal of that in the actual episode developments outside of foliage that we place in habitats, and as those animals have certain requirements of the amount of foliage they can have, I've not really been able to do my usual creative flair experimenting with layers and stuff when it comes to foliage, and we've not seen that for a while. So it's important to me that I show you that process right now in this episode as it is finishing touches. The other stuff we're going to be working on today is a little bit of lighting, and I may, if I have time in the episode, put in a little bit more building decoration as well, because we have a few things in this area that we need to finish off, and Old Town as well. There's a couple of buildings there that are still bare plaster with not much put on them. I may put that in today, or we might just save it and I will show you what I do in the actual tour episode. These things do take a long time to put together, and I was conscious that a lot of the things I'd promised in earlier videos to kind of do these finishing touches off camera, I didn't have time to do because I spent so much time recording actual episodic content. And that's a little bit my own criticism and kind of time management and stuff, but that's one of the things that I've learned when you come to do these YouTube channels and things. It can get a little bit difficult, and when you're juggling real life and everything as well, you do sometimes fall behind or get a bit of creator burnout and things like that. But it's really important to me that I communicate that honestly with you guys as viewers, because it wouldn't be fair for me to kind of say everything's fine, I promise things are going to get done, because it's been a difficult start of the year. I've been really busy and I've not had a lot of time to actually enjoy the game, but I am still doing it and still not giving up on this zoo because I am really enjoying the process so far. Anyway, the car park you can see here, it's a basic one-way system. Cars can come in, drive around the car park, find a space, and then park up, and when they leave, they go out one way. And that seemed fine until I started designing this barrier, which for some strange reason I decided to design an exit barrier on the entrance barrier. So the entrance to the car park itself doesn't actually have any sort of barriers in place. People are allowed to come, drive in, and then when they leave, they would then pay their kind of fees and the barrier would raise. So I created something using the European poles here that are actually mooring poles, just put it in place, and I wanted to put a little bit of mesh on there. I see this in a couple of car parks, certainly not in the UK though, where they have these risers that have mesh underneath them, basically stops people being able to slide their motorbikes underneath the barrier and get out for nothing. But yeah, I wanted to put that in, and then we put a little guest stop sign in there as well. And the idea is that this mesh would kind of, as it rises, the mesh kind of folds in on itself. So it's not actually a static mesh, it's something that kind of would billow in the wind, I guess. We moved that into the correct location anyway, and then got rid of the original barrier that I designed here because I decided that I didn't really need it. I had ideas to put in little security huts here, but I don't think that's necessary. It's just kind of extra fluff that I don't think I need. I think just having the car park here is enough. The main attraction is going to be the foliage and the forested areas that we're putting in alongside this. I did think about putting in some blackthorn bushes there, but they didn't really work, so I went for something a little bit more clinical. Now, looking at the rest of the zoo, you kind of have this wild feature where everything has kind of been allowed to get overgrown and these lush forests have cropped up around Old Town and all of that. So for this area, I wanted something a little bit more clean, which is why I put in these very deliberate plants. So we're using twin flower and azaleas here, and then we're going to put a variation of different cypress trees in different heights, almost as if this area has been cultivated and deliberately grown and maintained in this way, because that's the theme that we're going for here. It's modern, it's clean and clinical, and it's very, very deliberate. So there's been a design choice here, whereas the rest of the stuff in the zoo has been allowed to grow whenever it sees fit. So almost as if you've kind of, the people who have designed the zoo and cultivated the area here have just kind of gotten those seed planters, the little packets of seeds that are like wild varieties of different kinds of plants and stuff, and they just thrown them down, and whatever grows, grows. That's the idea for the other parts of the zoo, or nature has just run its course and things have grown naturally there. But as always, I want to make these planters have a little bit more life in them. So while we're using a lot more plants and stuff like the azaleas and poppies and Dutchman's breeches and stuff like that, I still want the nettles and the bracken and the brambles to grow there as well, because it shows that this is a kind of an area that has been allowed to grow wild here as well. However, we do still need to keep those pieces in that are really nice and decorative, because they really frame the roadsides and stuff like that as well. So as you can see here, everything's looking really nice, and this is basically the theme that I was going for. Nice overgrown planters with a couple of really deliberate design choices, and it's all looking really nice, and I'm happy with how it looks. Certainly looks a lot more detailed than when we were last here and looking at this area of the buildings and the entrance itself. We're going to move on now and do a little bit more work in the forested sections that I've already removed. So here we are, you can already see this has a little bit of basic foliage in, and when I removed stuff from this area, this is our new exhibit walkway, by the way, which is actually the source of my disappointment with how things had been going. So this is why I wanted to come back. Looking back at that last episode, I really wasn't happy with how it had kind of come together. It was all kind of thrown together, and I feel like I let myself down. And as a consequence, I let down you guys, the viewer, and that's what's most important. So I want to do things right this time and do these little finishing touches. I'm already repeating myself because... Anyway, I'm showing I care. So we came back in, and what I want to do is focus on layers. Now, when I'm doing foliage, rockwork, and all of that other sort of stuff, I really like to build things up layer by layer. So what we're doing here is we're starting with our grass work and our rock work. I don't always start with rock work, but what's most important and what I'm going to focus on a little bit more here is grasses and small, low-level plants. We put all of those in first. That gives you your base layer. Then the next thing you do is putting in shrubs, bushes, bracken, all of that sort of stuff, and that acts as your secondary layer. And then the final layer is trees and flowers. That gives you the pops of colour and the different textures that you need to really make a place stand out. So here we're using olive trees and a couple of other staples in my builds like the black poplars and stuff. And they just give a nice coverage, holly trees going in there as well. And then what we do is we duplicate swathes of this stuff, move it along. Now, one thing I do need to mention about duplication is if you are making these little patchworks and you want to stitch everything together and make it look good, it's really important that you come back and check over things. And that might mean removing a few bushes and plants everywhere and taking out a few flowers to replace them with a different variation. And that's because the last thing you want to do when you're making these sort of builds is have huge swathes of duplicated material, because it looks so obvious and it's incredibly distracting. So I always make the effort when I've made these large duplications to go back, remove things, rotate things, take a few bits and pieces out here and there, and use the terrain paint tools like we're doing in this section here to make something look different to the kind of generalized stuff that you've already duplicated and moved across. The last thing I want to do is create something that just looks like a copy-paste job, which is why I'm always going back, checking, going down to like guest level, getting a nice eyeline view of things and seeing how it sits in with the environment. When you're decorating large patches, it can be very tempting to just do mass duplications all the way through, and it looks really obvious. So I really like to create my little layers. Maybe I'll do 2 or 3 different blueprints, which we're going to do later in another section of the zoo where I show you a large forested area that I'm creating around the outskirts of Old Town, because all of those trees on the outside have been removed as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about my process when we get to that part of the video. But you can see here everything's really starting to come together again in this area, and this is going to be a little bit of a expose on how I do things. So we're going to do layers from the beginning. You can see us here doing these little grass verges with the buffalo grass, dry buffalo grass, and some little pops of colour from the meadow plants, daisies, poppies, fairy fan flowers, and a couple of other little plants to give texture, colour, and variation in the leaf patterns that we have in here. And that basically creates a ground layer of forest. What we then do is we move that into position and then add some trees, rocks and other bits and pieces, remembering to go back and look over our work and take out various bits of foliage that we don't want to sit in there, because it then starts to look like a very obviously duplicated scene. The other thing you need to be aware of is the cost of these sort of things. Nothing goes through here. It's literally just a background to the guest's pathway. So we don't need to go too much on the detail. And what I like to do is fade that detail out as you get further away from the guest's eye line. So right next to the path, we have a very, very detailed piece that then goes further back. And as you get this like thick tree coverage towards the back of that area, you then don't need to focus so much on the ground patterns and stuff like that, because those trees will heavily mask that. And it also helps if you put in a little bit of rockwork, and this is where I'll tend to start using my long grass as well, because as that long grass kind of interferes with the items that you've actually put down, you lose the effectiveness of having a really detailed ground level of texture. And that sums it up pretty much. So here we've kind of gone a little bit further back, and you can see us doing smaller patterns and stuff, and we just want to create a nice little area here of bits that are rotated, put into place, and then we kind of go in and do a little bit more intricate detailing. You can see here where I've created gaps. I'm then grabbing that little sequence of rocks and moving them into position so that it doesn't look like, again, just a duplicated rock section. And that again comes with moving little rocks here and there, and then duplicating that, moving it over to the next area. And this very much is a repeating pattern for me. This is exactly how I do all of my big foliage builds, and I think it's really important to show that to you guys as well. And where they're interfering with the rocks, we take out foliage and replace stuff. Now, another thing I wanted to say is a couple of the more obvious things that you can see here that are duplicates, I'm then going to remove as well. So we put in our trees and we use black poplars again, because I think they look really nice. They've got like 3 or 4 different black poplar variations that have really nice textures and different displays of them. And then we come in with some big trees to really break it all up. And you can see the foxgloves there. They're what's making it obvious that these are duplicated pieces. So we come back in, we just tuck in little bits that are sticking out onto the path and remove a lot of the foxgloves. Now, we're not done. We're going to put in some more foxgloves as well, because I really like them, but we've also largely replaced them with azaleas as well, some of my favourite plants for the European theme that we're going for here. Well, temperate theme that we're going for. And then there we go. So we've removed the foxgloves that kind of made up the major parts of the obvious duplication that was going on, and replaced them with azaleas, some different colour variations on the foxglove, some fairy fan flowers, and the other sort of stuff that is a constant for our theme. I've already said this before, but I think it's really important when you're doing your foliage and planting, you make sure that you're not going overboard on the variations that you have. Pick 4 or 5 plants and have them as a constant theme throughout a certain section of foliage that you're developing. That's a tip from me. It might work differently for you. I just don't like to break it up too much. So here we are. It's night time now, so we're going to move on to the lighting portion of our development. You can see here it's looking really nice. We've got this dense forested area here, and it looks so much better than last week's kind of finish to the episode, where we just had a load of trees slapped down to give this background. And this is a background, it's just a more detailed background, and it layers as your eye line kind of is drawn to it. So what you'll see first is this lush background texture, the trees, a couple of rocks and stuff here, and then as that grass terrain paint comes through, you kind of fade out that detailed foliage work as you get to some of the larger trees in the background, which completely obscure your vision. And that's how we do it. And I'm really pleased with that, and I'm pleased with this development. It's looking much better than it did last week, and we're now going to kind of copy paste those methods throughout the rest of the zoo to come up with something really good. We're going to move on to the lighting section now though, because this place has been very neglected when it comes to lighting, and I really want my build to stand out at night time as well. Of course, I don't like a lot of the harsh lighting on Planet Zoo here, so we're going to be creating a couple of custom lighting pillars and just playing around with the intensity of the light when we get into it. Let's dive back into our speed builds and we'll explain a little bit more as we go. Alright, so this is where things got a little bit tough. Now, you're probably aware that I haven't done a lot of lighting in this game, and as a result, my experience is pretty lacking in lighting design within Planet Zoo. So I wanted to start with something simple. This barrier around our entrance building here needed something to finish it off, like a fence topper of some description. So I thought what I'd do is I'd light it up and then put in a fence all the way around, just to give it that little topper and finish off this area. There's a lot more we can do here on the building itself. I do think it looks a little bit bare, but I also want to be aware of the fact that it's a modern design building. It's not going to be crumbling and have little cracks in the plaster like the stuff in Old Town, so we need to make it different. Because I was using those East Asia lampposts, I thought it would be a good idea to use these East Asia fence posts to finish it off. I've left them red for now, but I may change them. I just need to find a colour that contrasts appropriately with that Australian timber that we're using for the actual base of the fence. I then had to adjust the East Asia lamppost to make sure that everything fit, and I didn't want it overlapping and sticking out. You know that these things have a little bit more of a larger base at the bottom, so they need to sit in very nicely and merge with the concrete floor and the fence itself so that there's nothing poking out. So we made a few adjustments and then brought in our fence. This is where some of my criticisms for Planet Zoo kind of come to light. We've got these lovely timber railings, and they're great as an individual piece, but when you run out of space and you have a small gap that you need to fill, we start to see some of the issues. The problem with these pieces is there's no individual part of it that you can then use to fill in a gap, unless you want to go through all of the rigmarole of looking for the correct kind of size of a piece of wood to make it fit. It would be really good if there was some East Asia timber pieces that actually matched the sizes of the individual fence posts in this railing, like just a railing top section and a railing support section. What we have is some other East Asia timber pieces that are called narrow end or square ends, and they're huge. So you then have to get very creative with stuff, and I had to make a couple of adjustments to the lights themselves. I wanted these to match up with a lot of the other building pieces so that there was a little bit of symmetry in there, and instead I had to adjust it to fit my railing. I could have completely replaced the railing altogether, but as I'd spent enough time on it already, I thought best not to. Moving on now, we're going to create some very simple lights to go around the outside of our paths and stuff and sit in really nicely with the natural areas. And I use these aquatic lampposts because I think they have a really nice look to them. They give off a lovely bit of light, and they're very easy to adjust to make them a little bit dimmer. You can just change the colours to make them grey, but it's also got a really nice warming glow to it as well, and a lovely area of effect. we sunk those in so we didn't have the actual supporting posts in there because they don't fit my theme. And then we used some Australian fence posts to create a base for the light. I wanted to do a few other little bits and pieces, and I did experiment with some overhead lighting. It didn't really work out well, and I made a basic metal frame that we'd hang some fairy lights from for some overhead lighting for when guests are walking through. And you can already see in our main entrance building, I've used some more hanging lights and the New World floor lights to illuminate that area inside the building, just to give it a little bit more colour and give our guests a little bit more vision when they're walking through the zoo, because you can't see a bloody thing when it's dark in here. And then we came to design this overhead light. Now, I really wanted to use these nice stands. I think they're New World stands as well, or they may be Australia stands. I think a lot of the textures and architecture within both New World and Australia fit very nicely together. And nothing seemed to work, so I ended up going back to my tried and tested Planet Zoo pieces because they're very basic and they create the frame that I'm looking for. Now, obviously these could do with a little bit more support, just to really give them a little bit more detail to them and make it look like they're not going to blow over when we get a little gust of wind, but we can do that another time. I just think it's nice to get the lighting down immediately, and I'll maybe make some adjustments on these to give them a bit more of a solid platform to sit on so they don't start wobbling around all over the place in the wind. Obviously that's not going to happen in game, but you know, we've got to kind of be creative here and be detailed as we go. So these came in, they were very simple, and I think they just give off enough light to give a nice little glow to guests as they come through. And I'm quite happy with how that's all gone. And then we started duplicating these and moving them into various different areas within our zoo to give a nice finishing touch. I did use more of these lights than the overhead ones because I think it's nice to have lights right down there on the ground level. Overhead lighting's great, but because of the limitations to some of these beams of light, you don't get a lot of light on the paths. So it's nice to have ground level lighting, and we just adjusted some of the colours, make them grey rather than white on your light colours, and it just gives a nice warming glow in amongst the foliage and hopefully out onto the path a little bit. I also wanted to light up this fake path that I made through the staff area, and it's all looking really nice. Of course, we're going to move to Old Town and do some lighting there, but I'm going to make something a little bit different for those areas. These fit in really nicely with the theme here, but they won't fit well in Old Town itself. It's been a while since we visited Old Town, so I'm looking forward to getting back to it, and we will dive straight onto the next part of the video and do those lights now. Alright, so in Old Town, things are a little bit different. We're using the conservation baskets that usually house the conservation light bulbs, but we're putting the Arctic festive bauble lights in there. And I think that's a really nice touch. I've always loved those bauble lights. They look really good in like foliage-based lighting things that you're looking to create. And we're going to use a New World sunshade post as our like lighting holder, shall we say. Whatever they call them. I've drawn a blank. And then we're going to hang some rope from the top of it, so it's this nice hanging lantern that's going to sit over the general public as they're walking through the zoo. Now, I played around with trying to find a nice effect here, but the larger ropes were too thick and the smaller ropes were too thin, so we just kind of wrapped it around the top and made it look like it was just hanging there freely off the top of the sunshade. This was then duplicated, rotated around, and we have a little bit of difficulty here getting it all matched up and nice, because I do want these to be straight, but we managed to work it out in the end, and it's looking really nice. Duplicated that back across to kind of fill in the gap because it wasn't quite sitting right, and then there we have it. This was then duplicated all the way around Old Town to give a really nice effect. I think it's got a lovely little glow to it. It doesn't give too much lighting off down at street level, but overhead it looks really nice. And you can see little pops of the colour from the light coming through there as it's glowing on the ground, but it was enough for me to be quite happy with it. I don't want it to be too harsh. I want the lighting to be really nice and soft. And you can see it lights more of the stuff that's directly around the bauble than it does below it, but it gives enough of a emission to make it look like a really nice, well-lit area. It then came round into the farmland area because I think it still fits here, having this nice natural conservation-based piece in there, and it really suits the theme of Old Town. and it's really nice to use a different like variation on pieces and stuff to create some custom lighting. There's a lot I would like to do further here as well, but I'm really happy with the basic level of lighting that we're now putting in. I think that's all I wanted to do because it felt like everything was really quite dark and dingy in these areas, and I want it to look as good during the nighttime as it does during the day. We have, however, left the red deer habitat for now because across the way from that there's nothing. Moving back to some foliage. Now, Old Town, they've been needing to have a couple of finishing touches to do it for quite some time that I've not yet got round to doing, so we're going to come back in and do our basic layering all the way through to make it look really nice. There's just a couple of areas here that were still left barren, but I didn't want to do something that was too distracting, and we just ended up putting in a couple of basic foliage pieces, duplicating them, moving them around and creating a nice like flat texture all the way around these little areas. And you can see as well some of the rocks that I'd put in, they don't quite match up to the terrain level, so I did a little bit more adjustments, adding a few more stones in just to flatten everything off, and then again duplicate the foliage throughout. And we did this around every single area of Old Town, but because you've already seen this kind of process once before, I'm not going to show it again. I'm just going to show you me doing the start of it, and then we'll jump ahead and I will show you the adjustments and changes that we've made. Arrowwood does feature very heavily because I love the way you can mix it in with rocks that are kind of heading downwards into a water feature or on like cliff sides and stuff, so that does make a comeback, and I'm really glad to be using that again. It's one of my favorite pieces of foliage. Okay, so here we are. This is looking much better. This was previously just a load of cypress trees that had been thrown down with some very minimal detailing in. Now we've put in a little bit more careful and considered thought. We've created a lovely backdrop with some really nice flashes of colour, texture and different dimensions. Those hydrangea bushes are looking really nice, and then we come in with a couple of cork oak trees and Japanese maples to give really vibrant colours to what is essentially just a nice flat green area. Also came around and did a load of mud textures around the railway line because you wouldn't get plants growing there when you've got constant 24/7 trains thundering past. So again, careful thoughts, working out where your details are supposed to go and creating a lovely new area. This is definitely looking a lot more finished and polished than it did before. Let's move on. Now what I want to talk about is doing what I've already done on a larger scale. Old Town is meant to be enveloped in forest. So we need to make sure that we are creating multiple blueprints and multiple things that we can duplicate to create our layers. And I want to do that on a larger scale. You've already seen the area around Old Town and how big it is, so we need to do that en masse. Everything we've done before in those smaller areas needs to be duplicated and moved into a new area to create multiple layers of foliage to really finish it all off and give a background that looks vibrant, detailed and dense. We're coming in with usual bushwork, grasswork and all of that other sort of stuff, making two different duplicatable blueprints and then moving them further around. And what I want to do is have this undergrowth go all the way around the entire area of Old Town, because the idea is that you are taking a train through tunnels, mountains, forests and eventually ending up right here in this little pocket of civilization that has been untouched for years until we moved in and started doing the work. I have in the past tried to run a path all the way along here to cope with any issues that I have with the train, but it's not worked. You could just see in the background there the areas where path had been put in and removed. The fact of the matter is there's actually nowhere for people to go. However, I may run a path all the way through the wetlands area that comes around the other side of Old Town with a nice bridge going over. Because I've not yet developed that area, that's going to be a lot easier to do. Now here, we're putting in a secondary layer, and this doesn't have a lot of detail, and it is just a very obviously duplicated piece of foliage that goes all the way around and just has a few rotations, and it consists of buffalo grass, Yorkshire fog grass, and arrowwood bushes. I'm putting those in because they're going to become our tree layer. So the difference in that texture is going to be the types of trees that we use. We're still kind of going with temperate, and we still don't want to overdo it, so it's going to be predominantly black poplar trees, as well as oak trees, and then some little pops of colour from some cherry blossoms. Of course, we're also going to be using cypress trees as well, but it's really important to get a nice thick coverage on the background. I really like the idea of using the cherry blossoms because that little flash of pink in amongst all of this green looks really, really nice. And this doesn't really serve much of a purpose, but you have to kind of think of it as like an artistic expedition, I guess, because you are layering, you're doing all of this sort of stuff, and actually all it does is serve to add background layers to what the guests are actually going to see. And yeah, you can see I made a bit of a mistake there. I have accidentally added a large oak tree to that little... So every time I moved the oak tree down, the rest of the foliage went down and all of that sort of stuff. So it was a bit of a nightmare. But we come back with our terrain paint brushes just to add little pops of difference in texture to the background itself. And I'm constantly going back and checking. You're going to see it in a little bit. The camera's going to go a little bit wild, but you've got to remember this is a sped up version of what actually took about 45 minutes to an hour of thinking and matching stuff up and picking the correct stuff. So we continually go down to guest's eye line and look at what they're going to see. All the way from the top, it looks great. You see the thick coverage of trees surrounding Old Town, and it looks really cool. But down on the ground level, you've got to make sure you're getting that right as well. So all in all, this did take me about 40-50 minutes to actually put together for just this little swathe of land, and I'm going to duplicate that for the rest of Old Town itself off camera. We're coming to the end of the video, so I'm going to show you little bits of what we've done in today's montage. It's just going to be a short clip to end this one, but we've done pretty much all of the finishing touches that we were setting out to do, and I'm really excited for next week when we finally get the end of season or end of segment tour put together, and you can see all of the lovely background work we've done in action. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Make sure you drop me a like, comment on what you really enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.
This one is